The ship came apart like a tin can in the hands of an angry god. Lieutenant Elias Kane felt the entire cockpit shake around him as warning lights screamed in red and orange, and the nav system spat out numbers that made no sense at all. Then, the ground of an alien world rushed up to meet him like a fist made of rock and dust. He did not remember the impact. He woke up in the wreckage with blood on his face and sand in his mouth, and a sky above him that was the color of burnt copper. He thought very clearly that he was going to die on a planet whose name he could barely pronounce. Korthon. That was what the mission briefing had called it, and it had described it as a Class 4 arid world with indigenous sentient life, classified as pre-industrial and flagged as hostile. And the briefing had said in very clear terms that no Terran personnel should make unauthorized ground contact under any circumstances. Elias pulled himself from the twisted metal of his dropship and looked around at the flat, barren wasteland that stretched in every direction, and he laughed, because the universe had a sense of humor that he did not appreciate. His comms were dead, and his long-range beacon was shattered, and his water supply was 2 canteens and a filtration straw, and his weapons inventory was 1 sidearm with 3 charge packs and a combat knife, and a damaged exoframe gauntlet on his left arm that flickered when he flexed his fingers. He picked a direction and started walking. 2 days passed. The sons of Korthon were merciless, and they beat down on him with a heat that made the air shimmer and bend, and his lips cracked, and his vision blurred, and he rationed his water down to sips that barely wet his tongue. And he kept walking, because that was the only thing left to do. On the second evening he saw it. A structure on the horizon, and then another, and then a wall made of dark stone and bone and animal hide, stretched. Over wooden frames, and beyond the wall, the shapes of buildings, and the glow of fire pits, and the sounds of voices deep and guttural, and not human at all. Elias reached the gate, and his legs gave out beneath him. He hit the ground face first, and the last thing he saw before the darkness took him was a pair of massive clawed feet standing in front of him, and the last thing he heard was a voice like grinding boulders, saying something he could not understand. When he woke again, he was inside the village. He was lying on a pile of straw in what smelled like a livestock pen, and the air was thick with the scent of animal musk and smoke and something sharp and reptilian, and he turned his head and saw them for the first time. The Vrethkai. They were enormous, and they stood 7 feet tall on average, with scaled skin that ranged from dark green to mottled gray, and their heads were broad and ridged with bone crests, and their mouths were filled with teeth that were not designed for plants, and their eyes were gold and slitted and ancient, and they looked at him the way a wolf looks at a mouse that has wandered into its den. There were several of them standing around him, and they were talking in that deep, gravelly language, and even without understanding the words, Elias could read the tone perfectly well, because contempt sounds the same in every language in the galaxy. One of them was larger than the rest, and he stood at the front with his arms crossed over a chest that was wider than a doorframe, and his scales were dark as iron, and scarred from dozens of battles, and he wore a crown of bone on his ridged head, and everything about him said that he was in charge. This was Torvon, the war chief of Garvol. Torvon looked down at Elias and said something short and sharp, and one of the warriors beside him drew a blade that was curved and jagged, and made from the tooth of something very large. Elias understood perfectly what was about to happen. Then another voice cut through the moment, and it was older and calmer, and carried an authority that was different from Torvon's brute command, and the warriors parted to let an elderly female Vrethkai step forward. Her scales were pale and faded with age, and her eyes were milky around the edges, but still sharp, and she carried a staff wound with carvings that told stories Elias could not read. and she spoke to Torvon with a firmness that made the war chief's jaw tighten. This was Sci-Fi, the lorekeeper. Elias could not understand the words, but he watched the exchange, and he saw the way the other warriors shifted when Sci-Fi spoke. And he saw the way Torvon's hand tightened on his belt, but did not reach for his weapon. And he understood that whatever Sci-Fi had said, it carried the weight of law. What Sci-Fi had invoked was an ancient Frethkai custom called Kethur, and it meant that any creature that approached a village gate without a weapon drawn had claimed shelter debt, and to kill such a creature would bring a curse upon the village for 7 generations. Torvon did not like it, but Torvon did not break the old laws, because the old laws were the foundation of everything his people believed. So, Elias was not killed. Instead, he was given Kethur status, which was a position 1 step above livestock, and he was allowed to stay in the pen, and he was given scraps of food that the warriors did not want, and water that tasted like it had been filtered through something that had died recently. And he was given a new name, Gal. It meant soft prey. The days that followed were not kind, and the warriors of Garval made their feelings about the alien visitor very clear in every way they could, without actually killing him. And they spat near him when they walked past. And the children threw small stones at him, and the young warriors shoved him when he was in their path, and they laughed at his soft skin, and his blunt teeth, and his small body, and they could not understand how such a weak creature had survived long enough to reach their gate. Elias said nothing. He took the scraps, and he drank the bad water, and he slept in the straw, and he did not complain, and he did not fight back, and he did not show anger or fear or anything at all on his face. But his eyes were open. He watched the warriors train in the sparring ring every morning, and he studied the way they fought, which was powerful and direct and relied on overwhelming force and natural weapons. And he noted how they held their blades, and where their armor was thick and where it was thin, and how they moved their feet. He watched the village operate, and he learned who carried water, and who stood guard, and who ate first, and who ate last, and he mapped the hierarchy in his mind, the way an engineer maps the load-bearing walls of a structure. He began to pick up their language, 1 word at a time, aided by the broken universal translator he had rebuilt from his multitool. And each night he practiced the sounds quietly in his pen, and each day he understood a little more. On the 7th night, Torvon stood by the fire pit, speaking with Sci-Fi, and Elias was close enough to hear, and for the first time he understood every word. Torvon said, "Your shelter debt protects a corpse that has not finished dying." Sci-Fi said nothing to that. Elias, sitting in the shadows, with his back against the pen wall, filed the words away, and his eyes moved to Torvon. And he watched the war chief shift his weight, and he noticed for the 2nd time that Torvon favored his left knee, and that when he turned, he compensated with his hip. Elias noted this the way he noted everything, and he said nothing, and he closed his eyes, and he let them believe he was nothing, because that was exactly what he needed them to believe. 3 weeks passed, and the village of Garval continued to treat Elias Kane like something that had crawled in from the desert and refused to die. But things were beginning to change in small ways that most of the Vrethkai did not notice. It started with a fence. The livestock pen where Elias slept had a section of fencing that had been broken for what appeared to be a long time, and the animals kept pushing through it at night and wandering into the village, and every morning a warrior had to waste time herding them back, and no one had bothered to fix it properly because fences were beneath the attention of warriors. Elias fixed it. He did not ask permission, and he did not announce what he was doing, and he simply gathered materials one afternoon and rebuilt the broken section, using a weaving technique and a knot pattern that distributed tension across the entire span. And when he was finished, the fence was stronger than it had ever been. Stopped escaping. No one thanked him, but no one tore it down either. Then there was the wall. A section of the village's outer wall had been crumbling for months, and the stones kept sliding out and leaving gaps, and the warriors had tried to stack them back, but they always fell again. And Elias spent an entire day rearranging the stones, using a principle of interlocking weight distribution that human builders had understood for thousands of years. And when he was done, the wall held firm, and it would hold firm for years. Sci-Fi noticed. She came to him on a quiet evening, when the warriors were eating and the fires were burning low. As she sat beside his pen, and she looked at the wall he had repaired, and she said in her slow, careful way, "You are not a warrior." Elias, who had been improving his grasp of the Vrethkai language every day, said no. "Then what are you?" He thought about how to explain the concept, and then he said, "I am a builder, and a solver, and where I come from we have a word for it, and the word is engineer." Sci-Fi tasted the word and found it strange, and she said, "We have warriors and hunters and shamans, and we have those who carry water, and those who tend fire. But we do not have a word for one who builds solutions from nothing." Elias said, "That is what humans do, and we have always done it. And when we find a problem, we take it apart, and we understand it, and then we build something better." Sci-Fi studied him with those ancient gold eyes, and she said, "You are a strange creature, Elias Kane." He said, "You have no idea." Over the following days, Sci-Fi became the bridge between Elias and the village, and she spoke with him often, and she answered his questions, and he answered hers. And through these conversations, Elias began to understand the truth about Garval. The village was dying. Sci-Fi told him about the Drekari, a rival mega-clan that controlled the northern territories. She described their warlord Skarn as a creature of pure violence, who had united the scattered Drekari clans through fear and slaughter. And she said that Skarn had been raiding Garval for 2 full cycles, and each raid took more warriors and more supplies and more hope. Garval had lost a third of its fighting strength, and the remaining warriors were tired and demoralized, and the village could not sustain another major assault, and everyone knew it, even if no one said it out loud. Elias listened to all of this, and he filed it away, and he asked questions about numbers, and terrain, and supply routes, and the way the Drekari fought, and Sci-Fi answered everything, because she had nothing left to lose by telling a soft alien the details of their slow extinction. Meanwhile, the young warriors of Garval continued to make Elias's life difficult. The worst of them was Rethok, a hot-headed young lieutenant who served as one of Torvon's inner circle, and Rethok was fast, strong and aggressive, and he had killed his first enemy at 14 cycles old, and he believed with absolute certainty that strength was the only thing in the universe that mattered. Rethok had been watching Elias with growing irritation for weeks, and one morning during the daily sparring session, he decided that the joke had gone on long enough. He walked to where Elias was sitting near the training ring, and he grabbed the human by the front of his tattered flake suit, and he dragged him into the ring and threw him into the dirt, and the entire village stopped what they were doing to watch, because this was going to be entertaining. Rethok stood over Elias and spread his arms and bared his teeth, and the message was clear, and the warriors around the ring laughed, and someone shouted encouragement, and someone else made a betting call on how many seconds the Gaul would last. Elias stood up slowly. He brushed the dust off his clothes, and he looked at Rethok. Did not raise his fists, and he did not take a fighting stance that the Vrethkai would recognize. And he simply stood with his weight balanced, and his hands open, and his breathing calm. Rethok charged. He came in fast and low with his claws extended and his jaws open. And he was 300 pounds of scaled muscle moving with the speed of a predator. And he expected the small, soft alien to crumble like everything else that had ever stood in his way. Elias stepped to the side. It was a small movement, and it was precise, and it used Rethok's own momentum against him. And as the massive warrior lunged past, Elias grabbed his arm and turned his hips and executed a throw that used leverage and angle and physics rather than brute force. And Rethok went over Elias's hip and hit the ground hard enough to drive the air from his lungs. The laughter stopped. Before Rethok could rise, Elias was on him, and he had the warrior's arm locked in an extension hold, was pressed against the joint, and the position was simple and devastating, and it did not require strength to maintain, because it was built entirely on mechanical advantage. Rethok thrashed, and he roared, and he twisted, and his claws scraped the dirt, and his tail whipped back and forth, and he could not get free, because every movement he made only tightened the lock, and the pain in his elbow joint was blinding. Elias held the position for 10 seconds. Then he let go, and he stood up, and he walked out of the ring without a word, and without looking back. The village was silent. 300 Vrethkai warriors stood frozen, because they had just watched their concept of strength get turned inside out by a creature they had classified as prey, and none of them had the framework to understand what had happened, because in their world, fighting meant claws and teeth and overwhelming power, and what Elias had done was something else entirely. Slowly, and his face was a mask of confusion and humiliation, and he looked at his arm as if it had betrayed him, and he walked away from the ring without speaking. Torvald had been watching from the shadow of his longhouse, and his expression had not changed, but his eyes had narrowed, and for the first time he looked at the human, not with contempt, but with something that might have been the earliest seed of caution. That night the village was quiet, and the warriors talked in low voices, and they replayed what they had seen, and they did not understand it, but they could not ignore it either. Seithi found Elias after dark. He was sitting by a small fire in his corner of the pen, and he had the pieces of his exoframe gauntlet spread out before him, and he was working on the internal mechanisms with steady hands. And she watched him for a while before she spoke. "What are you truly?" she asked, and her voice carried something that had not been there before. Fear, exactly, but it was close. Elias did not look up from his work, and the firelight played across his bruised and sunburned face, and he said quietly, "Where I come from, we learned a long time ago that the strongest creature in the room is not always the most dangerous one." Seithi sat with that for a long time, and then she asked, "And what is the most dangerous one?" Elias fitted a small component back into the gauntlet, and the device hummed with a faint blue light, and he said, "The one that watches, and the one that learns, and the one that waits." Seithi looked at him, and she looked at the gauntlet, and she looked at the repaired wall and the fixed fence, and the way this soft small alien had pinned a warrior twice his size without throwing a single strike, and she understood for the first time that what had walked through their gate 3 weeks ago was not a lost creature begging for shelter. It was something else entirely. The Drekhari came at dawn. There were 20 of them, and they moved fast through the outer perimeter of Garvol, like shadows with teeth. They hit the supply stores hard, and they killed 2 sentries before the alarm horns even sounded. By the time the village warriors scrambled to respond, the raiders had vanished back into the barrens, carrying sacks of dried meat and grain, and leaving behind 2 dead Vrethkai with their throats opened. Torvald stood over the bodies of his warriors. His fists were clenched, his jaw was tight, and the rage rolling off him was so thick that the air around him seemed to vibrate. But rage was all he had, because the truth was simple and brutal, and everyone in Garvol knew it. He did not have enough warriors to strike back. If he sent a raiding party after the Drekhari, he would leave the village exposed, and if Skarn launched a full assault while the warriors were gone, Garvol would fall in hours. And so Torvald stood there, burning with fury, and did nothing, because doing nothing was the only move that kept his people alive for one more day. The village sank into a kind of quiet despair that was worse than fear, because despair meant that people had stopped believing things could get better. Elias watched all of this from his corner, and he had been watching for weeks, and he had been thinking for weeks, and the plan in his head had been growing piece by piece, like a machine being assembled in the dark. And now, looking at the faces of the Vrethkai warriors, he knew it was time. He walked across the village square to where Torvon was standing, and every eye in Garval followed him, because the Gaul had never approached the war chief directly, and the boldness of it was either brave or suicidal, and possibly both. Elias stopped 5 paces from Torvon, and he spoke in Vrethkai, and his accent was rough, but his words were clear. "Give me 10 of your people," he said, "not your best warriors, and not your strongest, and give me the ones you think are useless, and give me materials, and give me 3 weeks, and I will make sure the Drekari bleed for every step they take toward this village." The silence that followed was the kind that comes before violence. Torvon looked down at the human, and his gold eyes burned, and his claws extended slowly. And he said, "You dare." "I dare because no one else is going to," Elias said, and he did not step back, and he did not lower his eyes. "You are the strongest warrior in this village, Torvon, and your strength has kept these people alive. But strength alone is not going to save them from what is coming, and you know it, and I know it, and every person standing in this square knows it." Torvon moved fast, and his hand closed around Elias's throat, and he lifted the human off the ground as if he weighed nothing. And Elias's feet dangled, and his vision darkened at the edges, but he did not struggle, and he did not grab at the massive, clawed hand, and he just looked at Torvon with steady eyes. Sathi's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Put him down, Torvon." The war chief held Elias for 3 more seconds, and then he dropped him, and Elias hit the ground and gasped and got back to his feet. And Torvon said through his teeth, "Take the Gaul's bargain, and let him have the runts, and when he fails, I will feed him to the desert myself." Elias nodded and said, "Fair enough." They gave him the worst they had. 10 Vrethkai that the village had written off, and among them was a young female named Kethra, who had been born with a twisted leg, and could not run in a straight line. And there was an old male named Fossok, who was half-blind in one eye. And there were 3 adolescents who had failed their warrior trials and been marked as unfit. And there were 2 hunters who had been injured in raids and could no longer fight at full capacity. And then there was Draga, had lost his right arm in battle 6 years ago, and he had been a legendary fighter once, but now he sat by the fire pits, drinking fermented grain mash and staring at the wall. And the village had forgotten about him, because a one-armed warrior was no warrior at all in the eyes of the Vrethkai. Elias gathered them together on the first morning, and they looked at him with expressions that ranged from resentment to confusion to complete indifference, and none of them believed this was anything other than a joke. "I am not going to make you stronger," Elias told them. "I am not going to make you faster, and I am not going to teach you to fight the way the warriors of this village fight, because you cannot win that way, and trying to will only get you killed." Draga, who was leaning against a post with his one arm crossed, said, "Then what exactly are you going to do?" Elias smiled and said, "I am going to teach you to think." What followed were 3 weeks that would change the history of Garval forever. Elias did not train soldiers, and he built a system. He took his squad into the terrain surrounding the village, and he walked every path, and he climbed every ridge, and he studied every canyon, and every choke point, and every depression in the ground. And he saw the landscape not as wilderness, but as a machine with moving parts that could be arranged and rearranged and weaponized. He taught them to dig trenches at angles that funneled movement into narrow channels, and he showed them how to build deadfall traps using counterweighted stone slabs and trigger lines made from braided animal sinew. And he designed spring-loaded spike walls that could be hidden beneath sand and activated by a single step. He taught Kethra, whose twisted leg made her useless in a charge, to be a spotter on high ground because her eyes were the sharpest in the group, and she could read movement at distances that amazed even him. early warning system using the vibration-sensitive crystal formations that grew in clusters across the Korthon Badlands, and these crystals hummed at different frequencies when disturbed. And Fosok, who had spent 50 years listening to the desert, could read those frequencies like a language. He taught the 3 failed adolescents to work as a fire team, and he drilled them on crossfire positions and overlapping angles of attack, and the concept of a kill zone, where multiple shooters could concentrate their projectiles on a single area. And he taught them that they did not need to be strong enough to kill a Drekari warrior, if the trap they built was strong enough to do it for them. He worked with the injured hunters on hit-and-fade tactics, and he taught them how to strike from concealment and then vanish before the enemy could respond, and how to use speed and confusion rather than standing their ground. And he worked with Draga. Draga was the key, because Draga had been a warrior his entire life, and he understood combat at a level that Elias respected deeply. And what Draga lacked was not skill or courage, but a framework that could use what he still had, rather than mourning what he had lost. Elias said to him, "You have one arm, and that arm is your left, and it is still the strongest arm in this squad, and I need you to lead these people, because they will follow a warrior, and they will not follow me." Draga looked at him for a long time, and then he said, "You see what no Vrethkai has ever seen, and that is that a warrior is not born in the body, but built in the mind." Elias said, "Where I come from, we have a saying, and the saying is adapt or die, and humans have been adapting since before we had fire. Pa. The squad trained every day from dawn until dark, and Elias pushed them hard, but he also did something that no one in Garvol had ever done before, and he treated them like they mattered, and he listened to their ideas, and he adjusted his plans based on their knowledge of the terrain and the local conditions. And he told them again and again that their minds were weapons, and that the battlefield was a puzzle, and that puzzles had solutions. By the end of the second week, the squad was moving as a unit, and their traps were lethal, and their coordination was tight, and they had something in their eyes that had not been there before, and it was not rage or bloodlust, but something quieter and more dangerous. It was belief. Meanwhile, Elias spent his nights working on 2 things, and the first was his exoframe gauntlet, which he had fully repaired and modified to deliver a focused kinetic pulse at close range. And the second was a makeshift long-range transmitter cobbled together from the wreckage of his dropship, and designed to boost his distress signal to any Terran ship that might be within range of the system. On the first day of the 3rd week, the scouts came running back to the village, and their faces told the story before their words did. A full Drekari war host had been sighted crossing the northern flats, and there were 200 warriors in the column, and they were led by Skarn himself, and this was not a raid. This was an extermination march. Torvan assembled his warriors in the village square, and there were 80 of them, counting every able body, and he looked at them, and he knew that this was the end, and he began to speak the words of the last stand rite, which was the Vrethkai tradition of accepting death with honor. Elias stepped forward and interrupted him. "You fight their way, and you die on their terms," he said, and his voice was calm and clear, and it carried across the square. "Fight my way, and they walk into a grave they dug themselves." Torvan looked at the human, and then he looked at Draga's squad standing behind Elias in formation, and he saw something in them that had not been there 3 weeks ago. Against every instinct he had, he nodded, and the village of Garvol began to prepare for war. The Drekari war host moved across the northern flats like a dark tide, and there were 200 of them, and they marched in a column that stretched back half a mile, and their armor was black and polished bone, and their weapons were heavy and cruel, and at the front of the column walked Skarn. Skarn was a nightmare made flesh. He stood 8 feet tall, and his scales were the color of dried blood, and he wore a cloak made from the hides of war chiefs he had killed, and his chest was covered in the skulls of his enemies, wired together into a grotesque armor. And he carried a war axe that was as long as Elias was tall, and every step he took shook the ground beneath him. He had destroyed 11 villages in 2 cycles, and he had never lost a battle. And he was coming to Garval to finish what he had started. And when it was over, he intended to salt the earth where the village had stood, so that nothing would ever grow there again. He expected it to be easy. Scouts had told him that Garval was weak and desperate, and that its war chief was injured, and that its warriors numbered fewer than 100. And Skarn had laughed and said that he would be home before the second sun set. He was wrong. Elias had spent 3 weeks turning the terrain around Garval into a weapon, and the Drekhari war host had no idea what it was walking into. The first phase was the funnel. Elias had studied every approach to the village, and he had identified the natural paths that a large force would take, because large forces always took the easy ground, and he had blocked every approach except one, using collapsed rock barriers and hidden trenches that looked natural, but were not, and the only open path led through a narrow canyon that cut between 2 ridges, and it was the obvious route, and that was exactly the point. The Drekhari entered the canyon without hesitation, because they had walked it before, and it had always been safe, and Skarn led. From the front, because he feared nothing, and the column stretched out behind him like a snake entering a tunnel. The second phase was the bleed. Halfway through the canyon, the first trap triggered, and a trip line pulled taut, and a counterweight released, and a wall of sharpened stakes swung down from the canyon wall, and it hit the column at chest height, and 6 Drekhari warriors died in the first second without a single enemy in sight. Chaos erupted. Warriors roared and drew weapons and looked for someone to fight, but there was no one there. And then the ground gave way beneath a cluster of them, and they fell into a pit lined with fire-hardened spikes, and more screams joined the noise, and then rocks began to fall from the ridge above, where Fosak had rigged a cascade trigger, and the stones crushed 3 more warriors, and the column bunched together in panic. From the elevated positions on both ridges, Draga's squad opened fire. They used heavy crossbows that Elias had helped them modify for accuracy, and they fired from concealment, and they aimed for gaps in armor, and they did not try to hold their positions, because Elias had taught them to shoot and move, and shoot and move, and never be where the enemy expected. Kethra was on the highest point, calling positions and movements, and her sharp eyes tracked the Drekhari response, and she relayed information to the fire teams, using a system of hand signals that Elias had adapted from Terran military doctrine. The Drekhari pushed forward, because that was what Drekhari did, and they were savage and fearless, and they clawed over the bodies of their fallen, and they charged toward the source of the crossbow fire. But by the time they reached the positions, the shooters were gone, and there were only empty nests and more tripwires. By the time the war host cleared the canyon, they had lost 40 warriors, and they had not laid a claw on a single defender. And Skarn was screaming with rage, and his eyes were wild, and he drove his warriors forward with threats and blows, and the column burst out of the canyon into the wide clearing before the village gates. And the third phase was the kill box. The clearing looked open and inviting, and it looked like a place where a superior force could spread out and use its numbers. And that was what the Drekhari did. And they poured out of the canyon mouth and spread into attack formation, and they charged toward the gates of Garval, and the ground opened beneath them. Elias had spent 2 weeks engineering the clearing, and beneath the thin crust of sand and packed earth, there were concealed ditches 3 feet deep, lined with angled stakes. And between the ditches, there were channels filled with rendered animal fat, and at the edges of the clearing, there were fire pots on buried trigger lines. The first wave of Drekhari hit the ditches and went down hard, and the warriors behind them stumbled over the fallen, charge lost all momentum. And then the fire pots triggered, and the oil channels ignited, and lines of flame cut across the clearing, dividing the war host into isolated pockets. Draega's squad hit them from the flanks with crossbow fire, and the shooters were in prepared positions with clear sight lines, and they poured bolts into the confused and burning mass of warriors below. The fourth phase was the hammer. Torvald and his elite warriors had been held in reserve behind the village walls, and they had been waiting and listening. And when Elias gave the signal, which was a sharp blast from a salvaged ship horn, Torvald led his 80 warriors through concealed exits in the wall, and they hit the Drakari from both sides. The impact was devastating. The Drakari were trapped in a burning killbox, being shot at from elevated positions, and now they were being hit by fresh warriors on both flanks, and they were disorganized and demoralized, and for the first time in memory, a Drakari war host began to break. But the battle was far from over, because the Drakari were still warriors, and they were still dangerous, and they fought with the fury of cornered predators, and the combat in the clearing became close and vicious and personal. Elias was in the thick of it. He fought alongside Draega's squad on the left flank, and his exo-frame gauntlet was active and humming with blue energy, and he carried his combat knife in his right hand, and he was small and fast, and he moved through the chaos like water through rocks. A Drakari breacher squad, 3 warriors in heavy bone armor, broke through the line and headed straight for Draega's position, and Elias intercepted them. The first warrior swung a massive club, and Elias ducked under it, and drove his knife into the gap between the warrior's chest plates, and twisted and pulled free, and the warrior stumbled, and Elias hit him with a kinetic pulse from the gauntlet, and the warrior flew backward, like he had been kicked by a giant. The second warrior grabbed for him, and Elias dropped to the ground, and rolled between the warrior's legs, and came up behind him, and jammed the knife into the back of the knee joint, where the scales were thin, and the warrior howled and went down. The third warrior was smarter, and he circled, and he watched, and he waited, and he was big, and patient, and dangerous, and Elias faced him, with blood on his face, and his chest heaving, and his ribs screaming from a hit he had taken earlier. They clashed, and the warrior's claws raked across Elias's shoulder, and opened 3 lines of red, and Elias gasped, but he did not stop, and he used the gauntlet to deflect a second strike, and he stepped inside the warrior's reach, where the long arms could not generate power, and he hit the warrior twice in the throat with the edge of his hand, and then drove the gauntlet into the warrior's sternum, and fired a pulse at point-blank range. Dropped P. Elias stood there, breathing hard and bleeding and shaking, and around him the battle was turning, because the Drakari could not adapt to what was happening, and they had never faced an enemy that used the terrain itself as a weapon, and they were breaking. The war host shattered. Warriors began to flee back toward the canyon, and they ran into their own dead and the traps that still waited, and the retreat became a rout, and within an hour more than 100 Drakari lay dead or wounded in the clearing and the canyon, and the survivors were scattering into the barrens. But Skarn did not run. He stood in the center of the clearing, surrounded by a dozen of his personal guard, and he was covered in blood and ash, and his war axe was red to the handle. And he was breathing like a furnace, and his eyes were the eyes of something that had never known fear, and did not intend to start now. He drove his axe into the ground, and he roared a challenge that echoed off the canyon walls, and it was the ancient Vrethkai demand for single combat. And it meant that the war would be decided by one fight between 2 champions, and the loser's people would submit or die. Torvald stepped forward because this was his duty and his right as war chief. But he had been fighting for an hour, and his injured knee had given out twice already, and he could barely stand straight, and everyone could see it. Elias stepped into the clearing. Skarn looked at him, and the warlord's face twisted into something between disbelief and amusement, and he laughed, and it was a deep, terrible sound, and his personal guard laughed with him, because the idea of this small, soft, bleeding alien standing in the challenge circle was the funniest thing they had ever seen. Elias reached down and activated his exoframe gauntlet, and the device powered up with a rising hum, and blue light crawled up his forearm like living electricity, and he rolled his shoulders and set his feet. He looked up at the 8-foot monster standing before him. The clearing went quiet. Every warrior on both sides stopped and turned and watched, and the fires crackled, and the smoke drifted, and in that silence, Elias spoke 2 words in perfect Vrethkai, with an accent that was no longer rough, but sharp and clear. My turn. And the silence became absolute. Skarn moved first. He ripped his war axe from the ground, and he swung it in a horizontal arc that would have cut a normal creature in half. The blade whistled through the air with a sound like tearing cloth. It was fast, it was brutal, and it was meant to end the fight before it began. Elias was not there. He had read the swing in the way Skarn shifted his weight, and had dropped low and rolled to the right. The axe passed over him, close enough to stir his hair. He came up on his feet, 3 paces away, and circling. Skarn grinned because this was going to be fun. The warlord attacked, again and again, and each strike was powerful enough to crack stone. Each one was aimed to kill. Elias dodged and ducked and sidestepped and backpedaled. He took the measure of his opponent, the way a scientist takes the measure of a specimen. Skarn was fast for his size. He was skilled, and he had spent his entire life fighting and killing. He knew how to use his reach and his mass and his natural weapons, and everything about him was designed for combat, from his claws to his teeth to the thick bone ridges that protected his skull. But Elias was not trying to match him. Humans were not the strongest species in the galaxy, and they were not the fastest, and they were not the toughest, and every other species looked at them and saw a soft, fragile creature that should have gone extinct long before it ever reached the stars. What the other species did not understand was that humans were something far more dangerous than strong. They were persistent. Elias took the first real hit 40 seconds into the fight, when Skarn's tail whipped around and caught him across the ribs, and he felt something crack, and the pain was white and blinding, and he staggered, and Skarn followed up with a backhand that sent him tumbling across the dirt. The Vrethkai watching drew in their breath, and the Drekari guards laughed, and Skarn walked toward the fallen human with his axe raised for the killing blow. Elias got up. He got up slowly, and his left side was on fire, and blood was running from a cut above his eye, and he spat red into the dust. And he set his feet, and he raised his guard, and he was ready again. Skarn's smile flickered. They clashed again, and this time Elias fought differently, because now he had the data he needed, and he knew how Skarn moved, and he knew the rhythm of the attacks, and he knew where the openings were, and he began to exploit them. He kicked dust into Skarn's eyes, and when the warlord flinched, Elias darted inside and drove a kinetic pulse into Skarn's left knee, and the impact buckled the joint, and Skarn roared and swung blind, and Elias was already gone. The warlord limped after him, and his face was no longer amused. Elias used the terrain, and he circled toward a section of the clearing where the ground was uneven and littered with debris from the battle, and he moved over it easily because he was light and nimble. And Skarn stumbled on a half-buried shield and lost his balance for just a moment. And Elias hit him again with a pulse to the right elbow, and the war axe dipped, and Skarn nearly dropped it. 2 pulses spent and 1 remaining. Skarn was hurt, but he was not done, and he was not the kind of creature that slowed down when injured. And instead he got faster and more vicious, and he abandoned technique for pure ferocity. and he charged at Elias like a landslide, with claws and teeth and axe, all coming at once. Elias could not dodge all of it. The claws caught his left arm and tore through the sleeve and into the flesh. And Elias screamed, and the axe came down, and he threw himself sideways, and the blade hit the ground where he had been standing, and buried itself 6 inches into the packed earth. Elias rolled, and came up bleeding badly from his arm, and his ribs were grinding, and his vision was swimming, but he was standing, and he was thinking, and his mind was clear, even as his body screamed at him to stop. Because humans did not stop. That was the thing that no species in the galaxy had ever been able to understand, and it was the thing that made humans terrifying, and it was not their technology, or their weapons, or their ships, or their numbers, and it was the simple fact that a human being could be beaten and broken and bloodied, and they would get up, and they would learn from every hit, and they would adapt, and they would keep coming. Skarn ripped his axe free and turned to face Elias, and for the first time, something crossed the warlord's face that might have been uncertainty, because he had hit this creature 3 times with blows that would have killed any Vrethkai, and the creature was still standing, and worse than that, it was standing differently than before. It was standing like it had figured something out. Skarn charged one final time, and he put everything into it, and the axe came around in a massive overhead strike that would split the human from crown to navel, and it was unstoppable and inevitable and final. Elias stepped to the left. It was the same movement he had used on Rethok in the sparring ring weeks ago, and it was the same principle of redirection that humans had refined over centuries of martial arts. And he caught Skarn's weapon arm, and he turned with the momentum, and he locked the elbow joint with his damaged left arm, and the pain was extraordinary, but he held on, because letting go meant dying. Skarn tried to pull free, but his knee was damaged, and his elbow was damaged, and his balance was compromised, and Elias had positioned himself perfectly at the fulcrum point, where Skarn's own mass worked against him. Elias looked up into the warlord's eyes, and Skarn looked down, and their faces were inches apart, and for one single heartbeat, the galaxy held its breath. Elias raised his right hand, with the exo-frame gauntlet pressed against Skarn's temple, and the device hummed with the last of its charge, and the blue light reflected in the warlord's golden eyes. He fired. The kinetic pulse hit Skarn at point-blank range, and the warlord's head snapped sideways, and his eyes went blank, and his legs folded, and 8 feet of scaled muscle and bone armor collapsed to the ground, like a tower that had lost its foundation. Skarn did not get up. The silence lasted 5 seconds. Then Draga slammed his fist against his chest, and the sound was like a drumbeat in the quiet. And then Kethra did the same, and then Fossok, and then the 3 adolescents who had failed their warrior trials, and then a warrior from Torvan's elite guard joined in, and then another, and then another. The sound built and grew, and it spread across the clearing like thunder rolling across the plains, and 300 Vrethkai warriors were beating their chests in unison. Ground shook with it, and the sound echoed off the canyon walls, and it traveled across the barrens, and it carried a message that would change Korthon forever. The Drekhari guards stared at their fallen warlord, and then they looked at the small bleeding humans standing over him. And then they dropped their weapons, and they knelt, because that was what you did when the champion of your clan had been defeated in the circle. It was over. The aftermath unfolded in the days that followed, like a story being written in real time. The Drekhari war hosts scattered without Skarn to hold them together, and the mega-clans splintered back into a dozen smaller clans, and the raids on Garaval stopped, and they would not resume for a generation. Torvan came to Elias on the 2nd day after the battle, and the war chief moved stiffly because he had taken wounds of his own, but his eyes were clear, and he stood before the human, and he performed a ritual that Seithi told Elias had not been performed in living memory. It was called the Kethvoron, and it was the naming of a warrior of the blood, and it meant that the recipient was considered family to the clan. and it was the highest honor that a Vrethkai could bestow, and it had never been given to an outsider in the entire recorded history of the species. Torvald placed his massive clawed hand on Elias's shoulder, and he said, "You came to us as Gal, and you are Gal no longer, and from this day you are Vorgal." Elias asked what it meant, and Sathi translated from her place by the fire, and her old eyes were shining, and she said, "It means the prey that hunts." Drega's squad became legends, and the adolescents who had failed their warrior trials were given new trials, and they passed, and Kethra, the girl with the twisted leg, became the first female scout commander in the history of Garval, and Fossok, the half-blind elder, was named Master of Warnings, and Drega himself became Torvald's second in command. And no one ever questioned his worth again. Sathi carved the story into the village lore stones, and she began a new chapter with these words. "And from the stars came one who was soft and small and lost. And he taught us that the greatest weapon is not the claw, nor the fang, nor the blade, but the mind that refuses to kneel." On the 7th day after the battle, Elias's makeshift transmitter finally reached a Terran patrol ship that had entered the Korthan system. A shuttle descended toward Garval, trailing fire across the copper sky, and it landed outside the village gates, and the ramp lowered, and a pilot in Terran military uniform stepped out, and she looked at the scene before her, and her mouth fell open, because standing at the gate of an alien warrior village, on a world that was flagged as hostile, was Lieutenant Elias Kane, battered and bruised with his arm in a sling made from Vrethkai leather, and behind him, standing in formation, were 300 alien warriors in full battle gear, with their fists pressed to their chests in salute. The pilot keyed her comm and said, "Lieutenant Kane, we have been looking for you for 6 weeks, and what in the name of everything happened down there?" Elias looked back at the village, and he saw Drega standing tall, with his one arm raised, and he saw Kethra perched on the wall, with her sharp eyes already scanning the horizon, and he saw Sathi by the gate, with her staff and her stories, and he saw Torvald, the war chief of Garval, who had once called him a corpse that had not finished dying, and who now stood at his side like a brother. He turned back to the pilot, and he smiled, and the smile was tired and bloody and real. He keyed his comm and said, "I got lost, and I found something worth fighting for." The pilot stared at him, and then she stared at the 300 warriors behind him, and she shook her head and muttered something about humans being absolutely insane. Somewhere across the galaxy, in a briefing room that would one day receive the report of what had happened on Korthan, someone would read the file, and they would shake their head, and they would add it to the long and growing list of things that confirmed what every species in the galaxy had slowly and painfully come to understand. Never underestimate a human, especially a lost one.